We've been looking at the life of King David. If you've got a Bible, you can turn to 2 Samuel chapter 12. We're going to finish this chapter today, honest. If you've been paying attention, it's like 2 Samuel 12, like I'm wearing out this page in my Bible. We've been here for like a month. It's true, I've been trying to take smaller bites so that the sermons come in somewhere less than 3 hours is my goal, and so far it's been working a little bit. But we're at the tail end of 2 Samuel chapter 12. And I want to give you a little historical fun fact, just to sort of set the stage here a little bit. It is related eventually, but some of you may have heard of a character named Pyrrhus. He was the king of the city-state, the region of Epirus, which was part of northwestern Greece, way back in sort of 300 BC-ish. None of you were around. It was a little before your time. But there was this guy named Pyrrhus. He became king of this area called Epirus, and he is remembered historically primarily for picking fights with his neighbors and sometimes his former allies. And he wasn't the only one. That was kind of the way things went in that season of life in the world. But this guy is most famous for fighting against and defeating the armies of Rome. And this was a big deal, right? He defeated the Romans in an area in southern Italy in 279 BC, and it was an impressive feat, but it came at a tremendous cost in terms of men and supplies. He was tenacious, some would say bullheaded and stubborn. He wouldn't back down. He continued, and he technically won, but at what cost? And so even today, when a person or a nation or an organization succeeds in something, but when the tremendous cost of that success, you weigh it out in hindsight, it's like, that was hardly worth it. We remember this ancient Greek king by describing it as a Pyrrhic victory. You may have used that phrase or seen it written or read it somewhere. That's what it means. It's when you get success, technically, yep, we check the box, but man, that, and this victory that Pyrrhus won, yeah, it marked the beginning of his decline, the decline of his kingdom, actually. He was dead within a decade afterwards. We're not going to be spending a ton of time on Pyrrhus, but we're going to look at King David. David was king of Israel and Judah about 8 centuries before Pyrrhus was born. So David hadn't heard of a Pyrrhic victory. But they do have some things in common. As we've read, David has been, at this point in the story, a very successful king. He has gained widespread military victory over his neighbors, the neighboring kingdoms and peoples kind of surrounding his territory, the ones that had kind of made incursions against his territory. It seems like every time David goes out to battle against the enemies of the Lord's people, he has success. But his reign has not been all sunshine and roses and victorious battles and parades and things like that. As we've read recently, how David gave in to temptation. He abused his power and the opportunities that it provided, committing adultery and murder, which is pretty bad. And we read how God confronted David through a prophet named Nathaniel, and he declared that, or named Nathan, sorry, and he declared that while David wouldn't lose his life or his kingdom as a result of his sin, there would be dire consequences for his sin. And just last week we read about the first of those consequences, the death of his newborn son. So this week we're looking at 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 26 to 31. It's kind of a transitional passage. It serves in the bigger picture kind of as a bookend to the whole David and Bathsheba episode. You'll remember back at the start of that, it described, right, it said something like, in the springtime, when, the time when kings go off to war, Joab, the general, led the armies of Israel against the Ammonites, and they were fighting against them, but David stayed home. And then we have this whole story about what David did, and Bathsheba, and Uriah, and Nathan, and all that. And now we come back to that battle. chronologically, these events did not probably wait until all of the deal with David and Bathsheba and the child being born and then dying and then the next child being born, Solomon and all that. This is probably like, meanwhile, while some of this was going on, what was going on the battlefield? We're going to come back to that section. Our attention is brought back to that battle. And David's victory that we're going to read about here is not technically a Pyrrhic victory, in that David didn't like sacrifice his integrity in order to win. They were kind of concurrent. But I want us to catch the contrast here between David's success in this passage we're going to read and his failure in the previous section. And I hope that in doing so, we see that this can apply to us as well. If we neglect the things that really matter, the important things, the things that matter most, even great outward success that we might achieve proves hollow in the end. And of course, the examples of this in our own lives and in popular media and in history, if you think about it, they're all over the place, right? People who, striving for a goal, have cut corners, done some morally questionable things, and they won, but at what cost? So I want us to look at this passage from 2 Samuel. So just going to look at it in two sections. The first one has more to do with Joab, the general, and the second part has more to do with David. So looking at verses 26 to 28, it says, "Now Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites," so that's like the capital city, "and he took the royal city. And Joab sent messengers to David and said, I fought against Rabbah. Moreover, I have taken the city of waters," or the city's water supply. "Now then, gather the rest of the people together and encamp against the city and take it, lest I take the city and it be called by my name." It sounds like it's hard to read the tone, right? It's a little bit like a text message. It's like, are they being sarcastic? Are they being serious? Is this a veiled threat? Is this encouragement? What's going on? It's probably a little bit of both, right? We're reminded here that the nation of Israel was at war against one of the most powerful remaining nation states around them, the Ammonites. And the Ammonites had kind of declared war against Israel in a really insulting way by mistreating some goodwill messengers that David had sent, right? The king had died, the prince takes the throne, David's like, your father was a good man, I'm going to send messengers, you remember the story? And the new king, who was the prince, like yesterday, his buddies are like, these guys aren't here to say nice things, they're spies. And so they take them and shave off half their beards and cut the bums out of their garments and send them walking, like just totally insult them, right? They picked the fight. This is the war that the nation of Israel is fighting, but David hasn't been leading this battle. He's been insulted, but he's been home. Joab, the general, is the one leading the army, right? And so when we come to this point, we are to remember, oh yeah, Joab's doing that. David had remained in Jerusalem. That was kind of the start of all of his problems. David ought to have been there all along. It was his clear responsibility as the king to lead the Lord's people in battle against their enemies. Whenever he's done that, he's been blessed by the Lord and protected and given success. Instead, he was back at home abusing his power against his own people. So the battle has been being fought, and after a lengthy battle and a siege campaign, from the sounds of some of the verbs that are being used, sounds like they fought and they've driven the Ammonites back into their fortified capital, and they've surrounded it and cut off they can't get in, can't get out, can't get food. And now Joab has seized the water supply, and we don't know, archaeologists and scholars argue about what those words mean and look at the geography and we don't know exactly, but general rules of siege warfare. If you ever find yourself, if you stumble into a time machine, okay, and you're back in ancient history and there's a battle going on, you might think it's safe to run into a walled city, and you'd be right unless they put the city under siege and stop your ability to get water. If you can seize a city's water supply, it's just a matter of time. You just wait, because you can't last without water, right? Go to a walled city that has its own well That's just a little tip from, you can take that one to the bank. Just remember, if you find yourself in a time machine, what did he say I was supposed to do? Get out of the time machine. All right, back to the text. So there's this key moment, right, where Joab has basically pursued his objectives militarily to the point where victory is almost, it's like I'm about to cross the finish line, and he stops and he sends word to David. And this is where I don't know the tone. Joab, maybe it's biting, it's got like a bit of a tone. It's like, hey, if you wanted to show up and do your job, I've done 99%. Do you want to show up and take the credit, boss? Like, that's kind of, right? Because if you don't, I'm going to take the victory. And it says the city will be called by my name. Whether that was like the rule, whoever's leading it, it's like, this is no longer Rabbah, it's now Joabville. I don't know. But the idea, it's like there is glory to leading the final push to victory. David, you're the king. You ought to be here. You should have been here all along. You better show up. Because it's like he's saying, I can't help but win. Like, it's not really a threat. He's like, I've taken the water supply. Just by default, if I sit here and play Candy Crush for 3 days, I've won. Like, they're just, so you better, like, now is the time. You got to come. Joab understood the political importance of this major victory being attributed to King David's leadership. One thing that some writers have suggested, Joab is less than loyal and there's maybe like some veiled threats of insurrection here. I disagree. I think this is probably the opposite. If Joab's motive was to steal glory from David, he wouldn't have sent messengers. He just would have kept doing his job and then led the people home victorious. And it's like, yeah, we beat the Ammonites. Like, what's David going to say? Why did you win in battle? Right? This would have been a great opportunity for him to seize glory if he wanted it, but he doesn't. He's loyal to David, and he understands the importance of this major victory being attributed to David, because David's reputation, both at home in the kingdom of Israel and Judah, which while secure, socially, culturally under the surface, there were a lot of fractures. Okay, it wasn't like one big happy family, and we're going to see in the coming chapters, you just kind of nudge a couple of things out of place, and the divisions that are under the surface just come up. We know what that's like. Like, people don't change. Our society's the same way. So Joab knows, it's like at home, David is the unifying factor. Their reputation in the international community is like, David's the man. David can't be stopped. God's hand is on David and giving David victory everywhere. And Joab knows it's very important that we don't change that story. It shouldn't be, maybe it's not David, now it's Joab. Is Joab the guy to watch? Are there two? Who is the boss over there? They've seen that before, right? Saul was the king. David was winning all the victories. Well, how did that turn out, right? Eventually, the people were like, David is the one that won our victories. So if push comes to shove, I'm sorry, Saul, what have you done for us lately? Joab's like, we don't want to do that again. David, you need to get here to win this victory. Joab, as near as we can tell, didn't argue when David sent him a message basically instructing him to arrange to have the loyal soldier named Uriah killed intentionally in battle. I want you to fail a little bit, Joab, to make sure that guy goes out and he doesn't come back at the end of the day. Joab, it seems, said nothing. He complied. He didn't complain. He didn't argue, right? But now it's like he sees enough is enough, and he takes the kind of presumptuous step to give instructions to David, who is his king and also his uncle, right? So there's like, culturally, there's no reason why Joab would be like, hey, moron, show up. I'm going to tell you what to do. It's like, no, but with all due respect, sir, now would be a really, really good time to get on your bike and get over here. So it's time for David to get back to work. So we see, what does he do? Verses 29 to 31, it says, so David gathered all the people together and went to Rabbah and fought against it and took it. And he took the crown of their king from his head. The weight of it was a talent of gold, and in it was a precious stone, and it was placed on David's head. And he brought out the spoil of the city, a very great amount. And he brought out the people who were in it, And he set them to labor with saws and iron picks and iron axes, and he made them toil at the brick kilns. And thus he did to all the cities of the Ammonites. And then David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. So in a nutshell, like David responds quickly. Joab sends him, it's like, oh, is that now? Okay, let's go. And he goes and he leads the remaining troops to Rabbah and he gains the victory. He's successful, right? Well done. They've won. This is a description of a resounding military victory, right? David got glory. It says when you read the verbs, David gathered all the people. David went to Rabbah and David fought against it and David took it. All of it is attributed to David, which is kind of how it goes. Like the leader gets the credit for it. But we know, like, David didn't fight this battle. Right? His soldiers did, his general did, and that's not wrong. That's what a general and an army are supposed to do, but there's a sense like David was supposed to be there. He wasn't, but David got glory. David also got honor here. It says that the crown was taken from their king and put on his head. This was a very symbolic act, using what was clearly a ceremonial crown, okay? A talent of gold. This was a 75-pound crown. Or more, depending on how you interpret this, 75 pounds of gold and a, singular, precious stone, which I don't know how big that was. But this was clearly not like the king's favorite hat. This probably rested on his shoulders and was the sort of thing that when the king sat on his throne for special ceremonies or occasions, it's like the symbol of the power and glory of the honestly pretty impressive Ammonite empire. And so quite symbolically, David sits on the throne. The crown is taken from their king, put on his head, which declares, hey, Ammonites, you're under new management. I am now your king, right? Your king's been defeated. Look who's wearing the big golden hat. It's me. David, he says. So he's got that. The people were now subject to him. David got glory, he got honor, he also got wealth, right? It says they carried out the plunder, the spoil, the loot from the city, a very great amount. It's like they don't even count it. It's like it was lots. Okay, this was the capital city of a powerful empire. All the goodies were here. They got it all, like the crown jewels and who knows what else. So he got lots of good stuff. And David also got power, because it says that he took the people captive and basically pressed them into forced labor. And the tools and the activities that are implied here, it seems he set them to work building, like fortifications and castles, temples, city walls, right? They were stone workers, like the picks, the saws are for like shaping stone. So he gained power over these people, and he didn't, like, it's not like he had to fight to the death with every one of them. It's like, no, I can keep you alive, just you've all got new jobs. Congratulations, you're all stonemasons. But I'm an accountant. You were an accountant. There's your pick. Get picking, right? So he got all of this stuff. This was David being a successful king, right? When they read the newspaper in the neighboring kingdoms, they're like, oh, did you hear that Israel defeated the Ammonites? Yeah, they finally fell. David, here's a picture of David wearing the crown, and they looted them. And oh yeah, like, were there a lot of casualties? Well, there were some, but it was a successful siege. So they took them all captive, and the Ammonites are now building stuff. Wow, David just can't lose. This guy is, I'm putting my money, he's in my fantasy king league for sure, right? David is winning. And yet, if you read this in context, and I mean, I've been reading this whole chapter several times, kind of in prepping for this, it's like, it somehow feels hollow. The description is solid, right? It's like, yeah, it doesn't say David put the crown on his head, but he hurt his neck, and he carried out the loot, but it wasn't his favorite. Like, no, it's all good, but it's somehow feels hollow because it's deliberately set in contrast, right? The externals looked good, but internally we know David was never the same. Yes, he got glory and honor and wealth and power, but David also had guilt and shame over what he had done to Bathsheba, to Uriah, to Joab. David also had grief over the death of his child. And David had this unique dread, this sense of foreboding of the further consequences that were to come, right? And that wasn't like a vague sense that, oh, I just never feel like I can live up to God's expectations and I feel like he's out to get me. It's like, no, God sent a prophet and said there's a list of things. There's going to be consequences for what you've done. I've seen it, David, and here's what's going to happen, right? And they were listed in chapter 12, just a few verses earlier, verses 10 to 12, right? The sword would never depart from your house. I'm going to raise up from within your own family calamity for you. And one of your neighbors is going to take your wives in broad daylight. So David won, but he knew his victory would not bring lasting peace. The sword, symbolically, would never depart from his house. And he received honor, but he knew that dishonor was on the way. This picture of one of your neighbors seizing your wives in broad daylight, I mean, that is a huge insult. It's like, I don't know if it was God was wanting David to think, well, the last time I was insulted, that was the king of the Ammonites taking my important messengers and shaving off half their beards. It's like, well, you think that was bad, David. How bad would it be if a neighboring king was able to seize your harem in broad daylight? Dishonor is on the way. And while he had power over the Ammonites and his kingdom is secure, his own family was starting and would be further torn and broken. So there's a huge cost to what he has done that is happening at the same time as his victories. And so I want us to circle around and reflect on how this kind of applies to us. And again, like, I don't know that any of us have shown up late and your general seized the victory instead of, you hate it when that happens. And everyone's like, he won. It's like, it was me. No, you weren't. I don't think most of us can relate to that specifically. But we all have things in our lives, and the older we get, we realize it's like there are things that matter a lot, and there are things that seem like they matter a lot, but ultimately they don't. We can spend a lot of our lives not thinking about that. We can pursue things that if we had to sit down and evaluate it, we'd go, maybe it's not the most important. You know where we do think about it? Is at funerals. I probably attend more funerals than a lot of you. And the funeral of a person who maybe they didn't amount to tons in terms of rising to the top of their field or being very famous or very wealthy, but their family loved them and they were known to be a trustworthy person, a good neighbor, someone who would help you out no matter what. Those funerals have a certain tone. The person is remembered in a certain way that is very positive. They are generally seen as having lived a good life. Conversely, someone who achieved great success, maybe in industry or financially or those kind of things, but those who knew them knew it's like they were a total bear to work with. They abused their employees. They went through 3 spouses. Their kids are estranged from them. Those funerals sound different. They focus a lot on what a great person and what a mark on history, but we're not going to talk, right? And there's a certain, like, we're all kind of nodding, but we know, right? There's tons we're not saying. And everyone in the room knows, it's like, you know what? This person won at things that ultimately were less important. So we can all choose, right? But we don't get to choose in one shot. You don't get to sit down at some point. It's like, okay, you're 18, you're a grown-up now, so you need to fill out this form. Would you like great success in externals at the cost of your family, your friends, and your integrity? Check here. Or would you like a close relationships with family, friends, and integrity, but only kind of meager, unremarkable success? Check, and that's just what you get. You don't get to, like, you can decide, but you work it out day by day. You make the decisions 100 times every day, and if you forget what box you wanted to check, you can say, yeah, I checked the integrity box, but live for decades chasing the wrong thing. But ultimately, when you get to the finish line, like, you get what you chased. If we neglect the things that matter most, even if we get great outward success, and it's not a guarantee, it's not like, so that's the math. If I'm a villain, I win, and if I'm a nice guy, I finish last. It's not mathematical, although there's There's enough examples of that you could say it tends to be that way. But listen, even great outward success will prove hollow. So what matters most? I think we intuitively know some of it, right? I would say first and foremost, our relationship with God matters the most. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? King of the whole world, but God's like, who are you? I've never heard of you. I don't know you. What do you gain ultimately? Our relationship with God is the most important. That's a statement that looks very different to one who is inside the faith versus outside the faith, and I understand that. So if you're here or you're listening and you're like, of course you're going to say that, you're a pastor, that's your job, you have a vested interest in saying that. I get that it doesn't feel that way if you've lived your life kind of not in relationship with God. I would suggest, though, that there are times when honesty breaks through, in crisis, when you're feeling very alone. Sometimes God in his mercy just grabs you somehow through pain, through a sunset, through something beautiful, the birth of a child, something, and you realize it's like, there's so much more, and I'm missing out. Once we have reached out by faith and responded to the good news of the gospel, that we can have a relationship with God, not by being the best person on the block, but because Jesus died for us and offers us forgiveness. Once we've stepped into that, we recognize, we know, we basically said, I need Jesus to be my king. So I understand this is the most important thing. We sort of check that box. That is my priority. I'm stating that. When we're baptized, we are like emphatically proclaiming through word and symbolic action. That is the most important thing in my life. And yet we know that day by day, really hour by hour, we can decide to act as though that's the most important thing or act like it's not even on the list. And if we neglect our relationship with God, we might get great success. We might avoid great trouble, persecution, mockery, whatever. It will seem hollow. Other things that matter the most, I think, to sum it up, our responsibility to those around us. We're all at different ages and stages. We have different networks of relationships, but I think we have responsibility to people around us, right? And the Bible says a lot about this. We know, like, for example, kids, young people. The Bible says, children, honor your father and mother. And humans have generally understood this. When we are younger, we have a responsibility essentially to honor those who are above us in authority and in responsibility. And so we have a responsibility that way. As we get older and we get more responsibility, we end up with people who are depending on us. We have a responsibility to serve, to sacrifice for the good of those who are depending on us. And then we have special responsibilities in our relationship with the people around us, especially, talking about David, right? Faithfulness to our spouse if you're married. If you're not married, that doesn't mean you can have fun with other people's spouses. You owe them that faithfulness as well. So responsibility to those around us. And we know that if we neglect that, we might get what we think we want in the moment, but usually doesn't take too long before we start realizing, my family or those people, they're the ones that were with me for the long haul, and you can burn those bridges. Don't do it. Lastly, and this isn't an exhaustive list, I was just trying to think in categories, our integrity matters. Your integrity can be described, it's kind of like your reputation, but the thing is you can maintain a good reputation and still be someone that lacks integrity. You're just really, really good at projecting a coherent picture. Integrity is, in a nutshell, being the same person in private as in public. And if you sacrifice that, if you start allowing yourself to be one person in public, but another less savory, somewhat more shabby version in private, but as long as you maintain this, when you start going down that road, and especially if you are cursed with success at it, you're like, I'm actually pulling this off. You may gain the success of maintaining a good reputation. But there is a fracture deep in what makes you human when you start sacrificing your integrity that makes your victories ultimately hollow. Even if it's like, no one here suspects, I got the promotion, I got the raise, I've got the great reputation, I got the Lifetime Achievement Award, everyone is cheering for me. Yeah, but you know, you're like, I'm a huge fake. If anyone here knew even half of they wouldn't be clapping, right? So the victory becomes hollow. As I said, we can neglect the things that matter most and still win. It's possible, right? We can do our job, we can get the promotion, we can play our role, and we can do it well. We can be seen as successful, but it'll be hollow. You know what? We can even do this with our religious life, our spiritual life, our religious observances. Because you might be sitting here, and especially if you're visiting or watching at home or whatever, and you're not really like a church person, you're like, well, of course, church guy's going to say this because the important thing, right? Don't go to, don't be a workaholic, come to church. Listen, you can win at coming to church and it can be a hollow victory. You can do spiritually mature looking, Christian looking, religious looking things. You can maintain a high level of external religious observance and it be a hollow victory. One of the most common arguments, if you spend a lot of time talking with non-Christians who really want to be non-Christians, a lot of their argument for that stance is they've known some Christians who are really good at being Christians, right? Go to church, serve on the board, do whatever their particular scorecard is, but it's like, but they were what? A horrible neighbor, a mean parent, they cheated on their wife, they whatever, right? And it's like, it didn't. Jesus spoke about this as well. Matthew 23:23, Jesus has some hard words for some very successful religious people. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! For you tithe your mint and your dill and your cumin, and you've neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and forgiveness. These things, those important things, you ought to have done without neglecting the others." Notice, Jesus isn't saying it's not important. The outside, the external, the religious observances don't matter. It's just the kind of person you are. It's like, no. Doing the right things that honor God are important. But if you do that and you neglect the important things, the integrity of being a kind of person whose heart is looking more and more like Jesus' Jesus has a word for you. Hypocrite, right? Hollow victory. I think we get it. And I think most of us can, I don't know. I have no idea what's going on in your head. I know what's going on in mine. I'm preaching this to myself, and I don't need to know your stuff. I know my own. But Jesus had words about that. So this isn't just an Old Testament king thing. This is a up-to-the-minute Christian thing. Jesus, the son of David, embodied the very opposite approach, right? David had great external success. His reputation was widespread and stellar. He had victory, he had honor, he had power, and then inside it was coming unglued. And Jesus, in his life on earth, did the opposite, right? Outwardly, he lost everything. He lost his reputation, the little that he had, his friends, his freedom. Ultimately, he lost his life. He was losing on the surface. But he did so because he had his eyes on what mattered the most. And because of this, in a way, you could say Jesus' defeat was hollow. It was a hollow victory for the evil people who put him to death. Yes, we finally got him out of the way. Yeah, you'd think, right? Yes, we won. Yes, I guess you won. But it ended up being hollow because, yes, Jesus was shamed, but it resulted in his greater glory. And he was killed, for sure. But it resulted in resurrection life for him and for all who put their faith in him.